In a small American town, a routine traffic stop turned into a life-changing moment. When a crooked cop tried to frame a man with planted drugs, he thought it would be just another easy win. But what he didn't know was that his target wasn't just any man. He was the FBI director himself. What followed was a story of arrogance, betrayal, and a twist that shocked the entire department. On a calm evening in a quiet suburban neighborhood, David Cole drove slowly along the winding streets, his car moving with the steady confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. Dressed in casual clothes, his posture behind the wheel was relaxed, his eyes sharp yet peaceful, the kind of demeanor that reflected years of discipline and patience. He wasn't in a rush, nor was he distracted. To any passerby, David appeared as just another man heading home after a long day. But inside his silence lay a mind far more observant than anyone would suspect. A few streets away, Officer Rick Thompson sat in his patrol car, bored but restless, the weight of his authority hanging on him like a weapon he enjoyed wielding. Known around town for his aggressive stops and selective enforcement, Rick had built a reputation not as a protector, but as a predator, one who felt untouchable under the badge he wore. His eyes scanned the road until David's car caught his attention. Not because of any real violation, but because Rick decided it would be an easy target. With a smirk curling on his lips, he flicked on his sirens, the red and blue lights splashing against the quiet night. David glanced in his rearview mirror, his calm expression unshaken. He slowed down, signaled, and pulled neatly to the side of the road. There was no panic in his movements, no tremor in his hands as he set the car in park. When Rick approached, boots crunching against the gravel, his stride carried the arrogance of someone who already believed he owned the situation. He tapped on the window, his tone sharp as he said, "License and registration. Taillights out." "You know that, don't you?" David rolled the window down smoothly, meeting Rick's stare with a steady calm. "My taillight is working, officer," he replied, his voice polite, almost gentle, with no hint of defiance. That composure irritated Rick instantly. He thrived on fear, on making people flinch, but David offered him nothing but steady eyes and a respectful tone. Rick leaned down, his shadow falling across the car interior, trying to make his presence feel larger than it was. "Step out of the vehicle," Rick ordered, his words dripping with condescension. David complied without argument, opening the door and standing tall under the streetlight. His posture remained respectful, his hands visible, his movements deliberate. Rick circled the car like a hunter, muttering about routine checks, pretending to look for threats. But his real intentions were far from lawful. With one smooth motion hidden behind the open car door, he slipped a small plastic bag beneath the driver's seat. A bag filled with powder that would instantly turn a traffic stop into a felony. The act was quick, calculated, and to Rick exhilarating. His lips curled into a smug grin as he closed the car door with a slam, already envisioning the report he would write, the false evidence he would wave in court, the promotion he thought he deserved for cleaning the streets. He walked back toward David with the swagger of a man convinced of his own genius, holding all the power in his hands. David, however, remained unshaken. He watched Rick's performance with a quiet patience, his expression betraying no panic, no outrage. If anything, there was a faint trace of something else, an almost imperceptible confidence that didn't belong to a man caught in a trap. Rick mistook that composure for arrogance and felt his irritation sharpen. He wanted to see fear, wanted to break through the calm exterior. But David gave him nothing, only silence and steady eyes that seemed to look right through him. As Rick placed his hands on his belt and leaned forward, ready to declare his fabricated discovery, David tilted his head slightly, almost as though he were studying the officer rather than being studied. That small gesture unsettled Rick in a way he didn't understand, though he quickly pushed the feeling aside. In his mind, the game was already won. The drugs were planted, the charges ready, and the arrest inevitable. This was just another name to add to his list, another life to derail, and another victory for his ego. Yet beneath the calm night air, an unspoken tension lingered. David's silence wasn't weakness. It was the silence of someone who had seen arrogance before, someone who understood the value of patience, someone who carried authority far greater than the badge Rick wore. The officer thought he had trapped his target, but in truth, he had just stepped into a trap of his own making. David's quiet confidence wasn't accidental, it was a warning, though Rick was far too blinded by his own corruption to recognize it. And so the stage was set. A crooked officer, certain of his power, and a man who appeared ordinary but held secrets Rick could never imagine. The night seemed calm, but in its stillness, the balance of power was already beginning to shift. Rick crouched beside the driver's seat with exaggerated movements, his flashlight beam dancing across the car's interior. After a moment of theatrical silence, he straightened and held up the small bag of powder he himself had hidden minutes earlier. His face was twisted with mock triumph as he announced, "Well, well, what do we have here? Looks like you've been carrying some illegal baggage." He dangled the bag as though it were a prize catch, waiting for fear or denial to show on David's face. But David's eyes remained steady, his voice calm, almost too calm as he asked, "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" The question startled Rick for a fraction of a second, though he quickly covered it with a sneer. "Oh, I'm sure," he replied, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Guys like you think you can outsmart the system, but I know better." "You're all the same!" He puffed out his chest as if he had uncovered a major crime, but David's composure unnerved him. That lack of panic was not the reaction he expected. Just then, the sound of another cruiser's tires on gravel broke the night air. A second patrol car pulled up, and Officer Jenny Miller stepped out. Younger, less hardened by years of power abuse, Jenny had heard the call for backup and responded quickly. She approached with measured steps, her eyes moving between Rick and David with curiosity. Rick waved her over with a confident grin. "Got ourselves a dealer here?" he boasted, shaking the bag for her to see. Jenny frowned, not because she doubted Rick outright, but because the situation seemed too neat, too perfectly wrapped for a routine stop. "Really?" she asked, her tone cautious. "From a traffic stop?" Her words held a trace of skepticism, but Rick ignored it, already relishing his supposed victory. He yanked David's arms behind his back and snapped the handcuffs tight, the metal biting against his wrists with unnecessary force. "Guys like him always end up behind bars," Rick said loudly, his voice full of cruel satisfaction, as if he wanted the world to hear his false narrative. Jenny shifted uneasily, noticing the aggression in his movements, but she held back, not ready to challenge a senior officer outright. David did not resist. Instead, he stood with quiet dignity, his gaze unwavering as he turned to Rick and spoke softly. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." The words carried no threat, only certainty, and that unnerved Jenny more than it did Rick. She looked at David more closely, noting the steady confidence in his eyes, a confidence that didn't fit the role of a man cornered by false evidence. Rick, however, burst into laughter, a loud, mocking sound meant to drown out the weight of those words. "Biggest mistake? No, my friend. This is the smartest thing I've done all week." But as his laughter filled the air, Jenny felt a ripple of doubt sink deeper. Something about the way David carried himself didn't match the picture Rick was painting. There was no desperation, no pleading, no anger. Instead, there was a quiet strength, as though David already knew how this night would end, and it wouldn't be the way Rick imagined. She folded her arms, watching closely, her instincts whispering that there was more to this man than either of them realized. Rick shoved David toward the squad car with unnecessary force, opening the back door and pushing him inside. The cuffs clinked against the seat as David settled in without protest. From the shadows of the back seat, his hands moved subtly, practiced and precise. With a flick of his wrist, he pulled his phone from his pocket, concealed from Rick's view by the angle of the car door. His fingers tapped quickly, entering a code that sent a silent signal into a secure network. A signal designed to trigger an immediate response. Rick slammed the door shut with a self-satisfied grin, strutting back toward Jenny as if he had just solved the crime of the year. "Textbook bust," he declared, his voice booming. Jenny nodded stiffly, still uneasy, her eyes darting to the car where David sat in shadow. For a brief moment, their gazes met through the glass. His eyes weren't those of a man defeated. They were the eyes of someone waiting for a curtain to rise, as though the real show was only just beginning. Rick lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply, his arrogance thick in the night air. Jenny lingered by her cruiser, caught between duty and instinct, her mind replaying David's calm words. The biggest mistake of your career. She didn't know why they unsettled her so much, but she couldn't shake the feeling that those words weren't a bluff. Something bigger was moving beneath the surface of this ordinary stop, something Rick, in his arrogance, had no idea he was about to trigger. And in the back of the squad car, David sat in silence, his signal already sent. The gears of a much larger machine beginning to turn. At the station, the air was heavy with stale offie and fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as Officer Rick Thompson strutted through the room like a conquering hero. He slapped the evidence bag on his desk, the white powder inside catching the harsh glow of the lamp. With exaggerated pride, he began typing up his report, narrating loudly for anyone within earshot. Another dealer off the streets, he boasted, his voice thick with arrogance. Pulled him over myself, clean bust. Couldn't have been smoother. Every word was laced with self-satisfaction, as if he were already rehearsing the story he'd share with the press or his superiors. Across the room, Officer Jenny Miller leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her brow furrowed. She had been quiet since the arrest, her unease growing with every step. Finally, in a low voice meant only for Rick, she said, "It just seemed too convenient. A simple stop and suddenly there's a bag of drugs under the seat? Doesn't that strike you as staged?" Her tone carried careful doubt, not accusation, but Rick bristled at it immediately. "Don't start," he snapped, his fingers hammering the keyboard. "You're new. You don't understand how these guys operate. They're slick, but I'm slicker. This is what policing looks like when you've got real instincts." He shot her a look sharp enough to cut. Jenny fell silent, but the doubt didn't leave her eyes. She glanced toward the holding area where David sat quietly, his posture upright, his expression unreadable. He didn't look like a man whose life had just been shattered by false charges. He looked composed, and that composure was starting to gnaw at her. The night seemed to drag until the sudden roar of engines broke the monotony. Headlights flashed against the station's windows, followed by the crunch of heavy tires against gravel. Rick frowned, annoyed at the interruption, but Jenny moved closer to the window, her heart quickening. In the parking lot, a convoy of unmarked black SUVs rolled in, their arrival precise, deliberate, and unmistakably federal. Doors swung open in perfect coordination as men and women in dark suits stepped out, their presence radiating authority. The air in the station shifted instantly, unease rippling through the local officers. The front doors burst open, and in swept a team of federal agents, their movements crisp, their expressions stern. At their center was a tall man with salt and pepper hair, his badge flashing as he spoke with commanding authority. "Deputy Director Michael Harris, FBI," he announced, his voice echoing against the station walls. "We're here for David Cole. Where is he?" The room went still, the hum of conversation dying in an instant. Rick blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish caught on dry land. You mean the suspect?" He stammered, trying to sound confident but failing. Harris didn't even glance at him. His gaze swept the room until it landed on David, who rose from his seat with calm assurance. The cuffs that had once bound his wrists were gone. No one had seen exactly when they were removed. And as David stepped forward, the federal agent snapped to attention. Harris extended his hand with genuine respect. "Director Cole," he said firmly, "we came as soon as we received your signal." The words landed like thunder. Silence crashed over the station as every head turned toward David in shock. Rick froze, his face draining of color, his earlier smugness evaporating in an instant. His hand twitched toward the evidence bag on his desk as though clinging to it could erase what he had just heard. But the truth was already laid bare. The man he had framed, the man he had mocked and humiliated, was none other than the director of the FBI. David clasped Harris's hand, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Thank you for responding so quickly," he said. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to command, every word measured, deliberate. Turning to face the stunned room, he continued, "I've been in this town for weeks, quietly overseeing an undercover investigation into corruption within local law enforcement. What I didn't expect was that one of my own officers would expose himself so openly." His gaze landed squarely on Rick, who stood frozen like a deer in headlights. Jenny's jaw dropped, her earlier suspicions crystallizing into undeniable truth. She looked from David to Rick, her heart pounding. Everything she had felt but couldn't voice now stood in the open. Rick had not only abused his authority, he had targeted the one man he should never have crossed. Relief mingled with shock in her chest, because finally, justice wasn't just an idea, it was walking in front of her. Rick stumbled backward, his voice cracking as he tried to protest. This is a setup! He's lying! But the words rang hollow, his bravado shattered. The federal agents moved closer, their expressions hard, their presence suffocating. Harris shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. "No, Officer Thompson. The only setup here is the one you orchestrated yourself, and you just handed us the proof we needed." The station was silent, the balance of power shifting in an instant. Where Rick once strutted with arrogance, he now stood exposed, cornered not by the man he thought powerless, but by the very system he had corrupted. And in the center of it all, David Cole stood tall, no longer just a man in casual clothes, but the director of the FBI, a man whose quiet patience had just unraveled a predator in uniform. The station was heavy with silence, the kind that followed an unexpected storm. David stood in the center, his calm presence filling the room with authority, while Rick hovered at the edge, pale and trembling, the weight of his arrogance collapsing around him. Deputy Director Harris motioned for the agents to spread out, and they began laying files and evidence across the desk like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting to come together. David's voice broke the silence, measured and steady, carrying a weight that silenced even the whispers among the local officers. "When I pressed a code on my phone during that stop, it sent an alert through our secure network," he explained. "That signal confirmed my location and situation to the FBI task force already monitoring corruption in this county. They've been watching, recording, and gathering evidence for months. Tonight, Officer Thompson handed them everything they needed to close the case." The words fell like stones in a pond, rippling through every officer in the room. Jenny shifted uncomfortably, her doubts now justified beyond question. Harris opened one of the folders, sliding photographs across the desk, images of reports that had been tampered with, complaints filed by citizens that mysteriously disappeared, and even hidden camera footage of Rick taking bribes during routine stops. Each piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin, undeniable proof that his corruption stretched far beyond a single planted bag of drugs. Rick's mouth twisted as he tried to fight back. "This is ridiculous. You can't take the word of some—" His voice cracked and he stopped himself, the room closing in around him. He tried again, louder this time, his words desperate. "He set me up. He's framing me! This is a trick! You can't believe this!" But even as he spoke, his lies unraveled under the sheer weight of evidence. Every file, every photo, every video clip tore through his defense, until his protests sounded more like the cries of a drowning man than the words of an officer of the law. David stepped closer, his expression unflinching, his voice calm but edged with steel. "You wore that badge as if it gave you the right to decide who mattered and who didn't. You planted evidence, abused authority, and hid behind your uniform while destroying lives. But tonight, you learned something. Power without accountability is temporary. The truth always finds a way forward." His words weren't shouted. They were delivered with quiet conviction, which made them cut deeper. The entire station listened, every syllable a mirror reflecting their own roles in the system they served. Rick's shoulders slumped as two federal agents moved toward him. His hands were pulled behind his back, the sound of handcuffs snapping shut filling the room with bitter irony. For the first time, Rick was on the other side of the law he had twisted for so long. He was read his rights, his charges listed clearly: corruption, false reporting, civil rights violations. The same uniformed officers who had once followed his lead now looked away in shame, unwilling to meet his eyes as he was led toward the door. Jenny stood frozen, torn between shame and relief. When the room finally began to settle, she stepped forward, her voice low and heavy with guilt. "Director Cole," she said, her words careful, "I knew something wasn't right. From the moment Rick pulled that bag out, it felt wrong, but I didn't say anything. I let it happen, even if I didn't believe it." Her eyes met his, searching for judgment. David's expression softened, though his tone remained firm. "Acknowledging what you felt is the first step, Officer Miller. But silence in the face of wrongdoing is what allows corruption to thrive. You must decide from this day forward whether you'll stand for justice, even when it's difficult. The badge only means something when the person wearing it chooses integrity over comfort." His words struck her deeply, a lesson branded into her conscience that she knew would follow her for the rest of her career. Outside, the night air was cool and heavy with the murmurs of townspeople who had gathered, drawn by the unusual sight of black SUVs and flashing lights. They watched in shock as Rick was escorted out, his head lowered, no longer the arrogant figure they had feared, but a disgraced officer facing justice. And then their eyes turned to David, who walked out of the station not as a suspect, but as the director of the FBI, his presence commanding respect without a word. He climbed into his car, this time flanked on either side by FBI vehicles, their engines rumbling like guardians. The convoy pulled away slowly, leaving the stunned town behind, the image etched into every witness's memory. For them, the story of the night would live long after the headlines faded. A story of arrogance undone, of truth revealed, and of justice served. As the convoy disappeared into the distance, the lesson lingered in the quiet streets. Power without accountability destroys trust, but truth has a way of exposing corruption, no matter how deep it hides. And on this night, justice had reminded everyone that even the most untouchable can fall.